Good morning, guys. I'm going to go ahead and get started just in the interest of time. I know some people are still getting logged into our online. I am Erica Watson, and this is utilizing partnerships in mental health ministries. So that's where you are. If you want to be somewhere else, this is your chance to escape. This is a little bit about me. I am a licensed clinical social worker in Kansas. I've been in private practice for about 8 years, and I specialize in trauma. I'm also in my third year as the director of Christian education at the Presbyterian Church of Garden City, which is a smaller congregation, so I'm mainly looking at adult Sunday school and ways to reach out to the community. And I am really interested in the intersection of spiritual work and mental health, so that's what we're doing here today. And on your tables, you'll find a bunch of things that you are welcome to take with you. We may still have some people trickling in, but anything you see is for you. I also have some things up here that are my only copies, so I need them. But if we talk about something, and I might reference that there are examples over here if you want to look at them. They're on the floor because we didn't have a table. I'm sorry for the logistical challenges of that. But we can speed up or slow down based on what you guys are interested in, and I know Jill is helping monitor our chat for those of us who are joining online. So we can pause if they have questions or concerns as well. And Will is help running our tech, so we are grateful for him, so I don't have to be in charge of that. But I'm going to briefly go over why mental health matters and doing no harm, just because I feel like that's a good foundation for doing anything. And then starting with ourselves, what we can do to equip ourselves, and building on what our setting is already doing before moving into partnering with existing models and creating new partnerships overall, just imagining something totally new. So I'm going to go through this first part pretty fast because I think most of you will be more interested in what's towards the end. But mental health impacts a large percent of the population, and we'll look at a couple of statistics. And it affects not just our quality of life as far as, you know, suffering, our ability to engage. It can lead to death, which affects families, churches, communities. I know a lot of people are here because they're feeling this and they're hearing the talk about this in their communities. And historically, the church has played a role in addressing suffering. And we've kind of stepped back as that's become kind of more of a secularized, insurance-based, government-funded sort of thing. But I think there is kind of a movement towards the church going back into those spaces because there is a lot of need. I hear so many articles and talk about people who are younger, especially if we're looking at younger than millennial, that therapy is the new church, right? Like, this is where I find meaning, this is where I find identity and growth. And I think it would be interesting to look at what would it be to reverse that. Like, what does church as therapy, as a healing space look like? And what is therapy offering that we aren't? You know, we're asking people to dedicate, a week of, or an hour out of their week at least, and often people might spend that in therapy. How do we make our offerings valuable enough that they are worth showing up for and investing in? And the last thing as far as why this matters is I think we need to be aware that we need to help the helpers. Christian educators, this applies to you too, but like pastors in particular have really high rates of burnout and secondary trauma. A lot of times they feel like they can't say that they're struggling because they need to be the person who's holding it all together. It can be very isolating. And therapists similarly, like, why have the tools? Why, I shouldn't need help. So this may also look like not just helping people who are impacted, but helping those who are trying to do the work. So on that, it being a common problem, if you guys email me, I will email you this slide deck. Because again, I'm going through it fast. There's a lot of links for you to dive deeper. So email me. My email will be up at the end, and you can get this. But this is from the National Alliance on Mental Illness, their 2025 More than 1 in 5 US adults experience mental illness. And this is primarily based on people who have a diagnosed mental illness. And as you all probably know, most people who are struggling don't necessarily have a diagnosed mental illness. And again, big, broad strokes here. Anxiety disorders are the most common thing we see, followed by major depression. And less so some of the more specific and sometimes more severe mental illnesses, which I think we are doing a better job of talking about depression and anxiety because they are so common, but we do a less good job talking about substance use and psychotic disorders and things like that. So there's still a lot of work to do, but starting where we are at. And yeah, some statistics about suicide. It is, especially among young people, a very high cause of death, partially because they're less likely to be dying of natural causes, but this has been on an increase. So definitely something for educators and those working with youth to be aware of. Okay, the role of the church. Like I said, the church historically has dealt with these issues that are very related to mental health. These questions of who am I? How do I have a sense of belonging or the greater good? How do I handle when things go wrong, when there's ruptures in relationship or injustice in the world? And all the life stage stuff, relationships, birth, death, practices for how to deal with all of that. You know, we are, as the church, equipped to do this, right? Like, we may not be equipped to diagnose or make a treatment plan, but we are equipped to answer these kinds of questions for people. So the other thing I wanted to highlight is that healing happens in relationship, which, if churches are primarily communities, they are ideally suited for this. Loneliness is a huge risk factor for your mental and physical health. It impacts your life expectancy, how you recover from a surgery. So those, you know, meal trains and hospital visits, like, they matter on a very physical sense. And also the therapeutic relationship, just that connection someone makes with their therapist, is the most predictive factor of how helpful therapy is for them. More so than the therapist's level of experience, more so than what modality the therapist is using. The therapeutic relationship is what they call common factors, you know, like how much you trust them, how much, you know, you feel comfortable in this space. So those elements are things we can do outside of a professional setting, that warmth, that listening, and it is, again, the most important thing they're getting in therapy is just someone that they really can connect with and be honest with. Again, not to say we're totally replacing therapy. I am a therapist, I'm all for therapy, but there's so much we can do, and I think when we're just, like, you know, saying that that's totally out of our scope, we're not giving ourselves enough credit for what we can do really well. So in here, there's some resources that are kind of APCE USA specific. Do we have some non-APCE USA people in here? Okay, so unfortunately, what denomination are we looking at? Disciples of Christ. Okay, so I'm not really familiar with any disciples-specific stuff. Of course, you could use some of these, but like some of the programs and stuff may not be as accessible to your congregation. But most of this is going to be general enough that it applies to everyone. But for instance, the APCE USA put out this policy statement on dealing with serious mental illness and a study guide that goes with it. And it really talks about the theology of this. And this focuses specifically sometimes on some of those more severe presentations of mental health struggles. And it kind of covers two parts, like the land of exile, you know, kind of being in a wilderness space. What is it like to be living with a serious mental illness and feel kind of separated, feel kind of you don't know what the end is, where your, you know, day-to-day provisions are going to be. And the second part focus on God's call to comfort, our calling from God to be there for people in this space. So there's one study guide. There's a lot of great resources in that, if you can navigate the website, which is not always great. There's a link, so again, email me for the slide deck, you can get right to it. Helping the helpers, like I mentioned, I was gonna try to find the stats for this, but I recently went to a retreat with the Synod of Mid-America, and they had these statistics on pastor burnout and trauma symptoms, and they were like comparable to combat veterans, which is kind of mind-blowing, but a big part of what makes something traumatic or not is not just the event itself, but how we're processing it. And when we go through something with other people or get support afterwards, we're much less likely to have lingering symptoms afterwards. And like I said, pastors are often trying to hold this together alone. If I was faithful enough, if I leaned on God enough, I wouldn't need any help. So they do have more of those lingering symptoms. You know, they're holding other people's stories, but sometimes they have no one to hold theirs. And this may be true of some of our educators as well, depending on your space. So thinking about how we're taking care of ourselves well is important. Okay, so moving on to my second thing I wanted to highlight. Before you implement anything, I think it's important to remember that we need to be careful to do no harm. And that might seem obvious, but sometimes when we go into things quickly without a lot of thinking through them, we can unintentionally do harm. You know, the church can be a wonderful source of healing, but for a lot of people, they have a lot of church hurt and a lot of church trauma, and some of that was things that happened with the best of intentions. So I think just keep that in the back of your mind as you're, you know, discerning and pondering with your people in your area. Some first things to think about is confidentiality. A lot of times when we try to help people with things, it becomes talking about other people's things, you know, and then people are hesitant to share things when they know now everybody knows the details of all of my business. So I think a good question to just ask ourselves is this my story to tell? Would it be better to connect this person to someone or let someone speak on their own behalf instead of me kind of taking charge and spreading that around? Another thing I just want to encourage everyone is really think, is what I'm saying in any way going to add to shame, or if they had gotten help, this wouldn't happen, or, you know, if you're struggling, it's because you haven't tried or done the right steps. And we don't want to implement anything that diverts or discourages people from getting professional help. Like, you need to come to our healing ministry instead of going to your therapist doctor. Implementing basic trauma-informed principles can be really helpful, and I have some more on that in a second, as well as some more about what spiritual bypassing is. But over there on the left, you see people, they're having a lot of fun in the next workshop. You guys came to the wrong one. People do heal in relationship, but that's in healthy relationships. So thinking, how healthy is my church? How healthy am I? You know, so working on our own mental and spiritual wellness might be the first step to that ripple effect. When we are okay and regulated enough, right? Like, this isn't about perfection. We have the space to help other people. So sometimes when we go into a helping space, we're coming in with a lot of franticness and a need for things to go right, and that can add more hurt into the space. So again, just good foundational thoughts. These are those trauma-informed principles. So this is from a guideline from the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, so a government organization. And they have a really long, detailed guidelines for this that you can find online. It's not super user-friendly. But I found the PCUSA made a quick sheet with this for trauma-informed ministry that will be linked. This summer, my executive presbyter and I did a joint workshop on trauma-informed practices for our church order ministry team. So like that is something to think about. Like, this doesn't just have to be you or your church. Maybe someone regionally or larger can offer this, you know, a little more widespread. You know, ask for a training to be brought in. If that's someone local, someone in your church, some organizations that we'll talk about, some of whom are here at APCE. But just looking at that safety, that's physical and emotional safety, trustworthiness, back to that kind of confidentiality piece, peer support, you know, being able to have someone in a process with you who you trust, collaboration, letting people be involved in their own life, that's empowerment, voice, and choice, and being aware of cultural, historical, and gender issues. a lot of these things that seem really simple, like a lot of predictability, like knowing when something's gonna be, how long it's gonna be, if they're allowed to ask questions, if they're allowed to bring someone with them. When you have a lot of anxiety or trauma, that predictability creates safety. So that's not just, oh, this is a safe space because, like, there's not imminent, active threat, but like, do I know what to expect can go a long way. So again, starting a mental health ministry might just look like how much predictability and transparency do we have in the things we're already doing. Spiritual bypassing, I mentioned. So if you're not familiar with this term, psychologist John Welwood coined the term, and it is a tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. So I have a couple of articles here on this, and I offer counseling to all kinds of people. Some people come to me for faith-based counseling, and some of the faith-based people have a really hard time doing the work of therapy because of this very thing. So this looks like, taking a platitude or a verse to kind of like skip over the fact that we're grieving or there's a rupture in relationship, like things like they're in a better place because I don't know how to deal with your grief. I can't hold space for that. So this is just gonna jump right over the suffering and the lament and the holding space together. So on the do no harm, am I putting something in place that's designed to just help people cover up their issues or get around their issues rather than really being with people in the hard places? So it starts with you. Educate yourself. You guys are already doing that. Check. Success. And talk about these things. That could be in a formal, like giving a presentation, but also informally. Some good examples of that would be, people have talked about, instead of just saying, oh, I have an appointment, say, I'm going to therapy. If you would say, I'm going to the dentist, make it okay to talk about that. And, to your level of comfort, back to those trauma-informed principles, you have agency and voice to decide what you want to disclose to who, when. But again, if we want other people to talk about it, it starts with us being able to do that. And normalizing that healthy vulnerability. That doesn't mean always sharing everything with everyone, but being able to talk about, I actually struggle with this, or there was a time in my life when this story would have really, hit me the wrong way when I was grieving this particular issue. And that's really important. And yeah, just getting involved with a mental health organization issue around you, to make those connections, or a justice issue. I think it's important to remember that, housing is related to mental health. Economic stability is related to mental health. If you're in an abusive relationship and you can't leave, of course your mental health is gonna be bad. That makes sense, right? Sometimes we think, any sadness means there's something wrong with you, or any, anxiety means there's something wrong with you. Sometimes that's the appropriate reaction to your situation. So making sure people are in safe, healthy environments is huge towards making sure they're in a good place mentally and spiritually. Okay. Building from where you are. So making something totally new is great, but starting with, what is my church already doing? Where do I already attend meetings, studies, worship? The people are already coming there. I don't have to convince them, well, what time would people come? What place would people come? How do I advertise it? Start where you're at. A lot of what we're doing is what we call psychoeducation, but just awareness about these issues. This is what depression can look like, and it does get better when you talk about it rather than holding it in all to yourself. Other people have this feeling where you walk into a room and you think everyone's looking at you, you're not the only one. So building that in to, maybe that's part of your intro discussion question for a study. It doesn't have to be the whole study. Just what would one small step in that direction look like? So some of you asked about curriculum. And before I dive into that, I want to just pause for a second and just any thoughts or questions on some of those things to keep in mind before you dive into really making something mental health specific. Okay. All right, so these are two studies I have done in the past couple of years that I have liked. Of course, there's thousands of studies out there, and as some of you have mentioned when you were coming into the room, some of them say some really scary and harmful things. You know, like if you just go on Google and like look for mental health faith resources, you're gonna get a lot of stuff that probably does not align with your values. So I particularly liked this Every Thought Captive by Kyle Idleman, who is a pastor. We got this on Right Now Media, which is like a Christian streaming service. It's a little expensive for smaller churches, but I mean, if you have that, they have some really good stuff. They have some stuff that is a little borderline in my opinion, but this really talks about some basic cognitive therapy, you know, neuroplasticity stuff in a way that is very approachable and is very scripturally based. Boundaries by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend. I see there's a fan back here. I really like their work. They have Boundaries in Marriage, Boundaries for Teens. Dr. Henry Cloud has like an app subscription thing called boundaries.me. So I've taught this in a DVD type study. They have workbooks. It's just really good stuff. And it can be really helpful for serious issues, but also just like the things that lead up to stress and breakdown in relationship, you know, taking on too much. A lot of us need to hear those lessons as well, again, with the taking care of the helpers. So those are the two things that worked well for me this year. Books, these are just two that I picked off my bookshelf. I really love Altogether You by Jenna, I don't know how to say her last name well, Rismersma. So she's a licensed professional counselor, and this is a book written kind of as a self-guide through internal family systems therapy, which has become really popular. And it's super approachable. She sets it up with this, we all have these different parts of us. The part of us that wants to eat the Oreos and the part that doesn't. The part that wants to stay in the relationship and the part that doesn't. The part that's ready to turn in the resignation letter and the part that's like, well, you know, maybe another year. And she talks about these stuck points between these parts being a big part of what causes suffering in our life. And she talks about that through a spiritual lens. She does cover spiritual bypassing as a part inside of us that wants to, you know, just, oh, we don't need to deal with that. So great book. For self-education could be adapted into a study. This one, Healing Depression for Life, by Gregory Jantz. So he runs an anxiety clinic somewhere in the Northwest. And this is his book that's very kind of holistic, very bare bones, like thinking about, you know, what is your media consumption? What are you eating? How are you sleeping? Some of those fundamentals, which again, we are as the church well equipped to help people think about and implement well. He has some other things, like he has a book called Soul Care that has like little scriptures that go with like different kinds of emotional concerns. So I really like his stuff. Again, and this is a faith-based depression. There's a workbook that goes with it that you could turn into a study easily. Mental health lessons for kids. These are just 4 books I grabbed off my shelf again. The top 2 are faith-based. So the swimsuit lesson is kind of like about body and boundaries for like really young kids. The Fears, Doubts, Blues, and Pouts is really cool. These are Christian authors, Norman Wright and Gary Oliver. And they're just like little parables, basically. Like Bruce Moose and the What Ifs is about anxiety. It's my most common one. The what ifs weigh him down. He has to learn to fight them off. The bottom 2 aren't necessarily faith-based, but they're activities that could be used. The way I feel is just about all the different feelings. Building that emotional vocabulary, a lot of times that's what I'm doing with adults. What does anger feel like? You know, like, how do you feel? Good, meh, bad. Like, those are their 3 emotions, right? Like, so building the, like, what does angry feel? What is jealousy? What is grieving? So starting with that with kids is huge. You don't have to have a complex mental health curriculum. A lot of times it's just feelings awareness, coping skills. On the note of lessons for kids, like I said, you could adapt anything that has mental health education. The Child Mind Institute has some great resources. Thriving Kids is videos, and they're broken down like preschool, early elementary, middle school, high school. They have a list of the best mental health books for kids in 2025. Therapist Aid is like a worksheet and sometimes videos for therapists, but like they're general enough that anyone could really use them. A lot of them are like, you know, a breathing exercise, or like, you know, this was like a little video and a worksheet about anger that I have linked here. Moving into more faith-based, our church has used for our like kind of children's sermon things, illustrated ministry. I don't know if you guys have ever used them, but one of their big things is that it has pictures, and they are very diverse in their depictions of the people in the Bible stories. But they often talk about feelings, and it's okay to be sad, and it's okay to be mad, and it's okay to, you know, tell God that we feel sad and mad. So just real basic stuff that is very approachable, could build into what you're already doing. Over here, there are some resources, like Holy Disruptions has like a parenting app that they developed. There's a trauma and resiliency workbook for families that has a lot of those basic things that's from the Union Presbyterian Seminary booth. So any of these things, feel free to look at. Please don't take them, they're my only ones. But the stuff on the table is for you guys to take. Let's see. What kinds of things have worked for you? Like if you were going to recommend a book, a resource, a liturgy, a website, shout out, share with your friends here. And Jill has the microphone. If you say something, we want our online friends to be able to hear us too. In the back, yeah.
I really love recommending boundaries that heal. For teenagers on up, because I first read it when I was like 19, totally changed my perspective of my relationship, like tough relationships with my family. So I have a personal story to share with teenagers, and then I can recommend it to them. So I feel like that's worked, but if it's okay if I ask a question.
Yes, please.
A lot of times, definitely, this is good advice for working with kids. We want to be trauma informed. We want to be like letting them express their feelings. Mm-hmm. What are some good ways to have interactions with parents who are not on board with that? And that you have a relationship with. I'm not talking about just walking up to some parent and being like, hey, you're really mean to your kid. But how do you even broach this stuff with the parents?
That's a great question. So I will be honest that like working with parents who aren't like in love with the idea of making changes in themselves is one of my least favorite things to do. I just shared with my consultation group that was one of the least life-giving parts of my therapy practice last year. But it is a little different in a church space than in a therapy space. I would say sharing personal stories, like you said, that's kind of how you connect to the boundaries curriculum. I think some of the things I've seen work well is when people say, you know, I used to parent this way, or I made this choice about how to handle something, you know, earlier, and later I learned this other way, and this is why this works for me, or why I've moved towards this. So again, you're saying this is what my parenting journey looks like, rather than like, you know, it would really be more helpful to your I mean, it would, but usually that message is not received super well. So if you can think to yourself, like, were there things I learned along the way? The other thing I think is sometimes we choose choices that are not as helpful or constructive for our kids because we are not well ourselves. So with kids, we often talk about, you know, they're not giving you a hard time, they're having a hard time, but that's also true for the parents, right? So thinking about these parents were having in mind, are these perhaps people who need more support, right? Like, what are their stressors? Would they benefit from having a break? Or sometimes, they've just never seen a healthy redirection modeled, right? So when we do that around them, to be able to see someone, handle a spill with grace instead of with, a big shame reaction that gets directed towards the kids can be helpful. So I don't know if that's super answering your question or not, but I do think the personal story, the modeling, the compassion towards where they're coming from, the needs that they're bringing into that interaction would be my kind of starting places for that. Okay. Other questions or other tools that have worked well for you that you want to share with the group? Okay. Oh, Jill.
Erica, we just have a request for your email for the people online. Can I give them
Yes.
your Christian Ed, that one? The
Yes,
one that we
and
can-
the other one that's on the slides that'll be at the end, they can do too. So either of
Okay.
those will work, they'll both get to me.
Okay.
But yeah, feel free to share that in the chat, and at the end, I'll have my email address up again for
Perfect.
everyone.
Perfect, thank you.
Yes, please.
Hi, not the same person, but so how do you suggest this? Okay, obviously part of the answer is education, but when you're part of a church or a ministry that's been around for a long time, you have a lot of people with lots of opinions about mental health. And I mean, I've encountered people within my own family who are afraid of therapy. Oh, my cousin or my nephew, my uncle went to therapy and it like ruined him. They convinced him, blah, blah, blah. So, you hear these stories from an older generation, or, you just need to get over it, or things like that. But there is also a pattern happening now among like the parent generation now of being flippant with mental health. Oh yeah, I definitely have anxiety and depression. And like just addressing it very flippantly and
Almost the opposite
almost
problem.
the exact opposite, because it has become more common in our language. So where is that? How do you address like all of that? Not that I would have to as a single person, but yeah. It's a huge pendulum swing when you have a very intergenerational church.
It definitely is. I think one thing that's coming to mind with people who are a little more resistant is if whoever's a leader in your church has the ability to speak about these things through a curriculum, through a sermon series, that can begin to shift things. And some of this language about, like we see, lament, in the Bible, right? Like this is a scriptural practice, God doesn't say, like just get over it, right? So having someone say, that answer is not scriptural, right? Like that's not what we're about. That's not what God's about. Jesus wept, right? Those kinds of things can be really helpful. And again, speaking from, personal experience, someone says something like that and saying, I found that, there were issues I held on to for years, and it was only after I talked to someone that someone was able to bear compassionate witness, journey with me, that was able to move through me, be released. And again, like it's a lot harder to push against someone's personal experience than a general idea. Like you can say, well, research that, like that usually doesn't work well for people, but saying, I had this experience, or my best friend, if they're comfortable with you sharing their story, like building your kind of set of stories of, if this is the common barrier I'm running up against, kind of generate your list, like, oh, I know so-and-so is going to say this. What are your personal stories or your scriptural stories, which again, resources can help with that would be your gentle answer to my perspective on that is different. You know, it's invitational, inviting them to see it from your perspective, not kind of laying down the law of this is how it is. And I think on the other end where people are very flippant, this is hard because people can use humor to cope, so leaving room for that. But sometimes it can be very distressing when someone speaks very lightly of something that's really causing havoc in your life. And again, I think you just bringing, you know, an energy to that of like the level of seriousness that you feel like it needs. Like they might be flippant or be like, yeah, that is really hard. I know sometimes people, you know, whatever, like it really derails their life, or that's what you're, you know, spending all your energy dealing with that. So you don't have to correct their tone so much as modeling, like, oh, this is serious. This is heavy to me. This is big. Would be my first thought with that. Does that answer your question?
Of online things. First, Julie wanted to share, let me find that, tools to share. In 2012, Orlando, I'm assuming, Julie, you mean the APCE annual event, we learned about sand tray storying. I have found this to be tremendously helpful. I'm not aware of that, so I was not in that, but maybe we can Google a little bit more information, or maybe Julie could even give us a link if she has anything. And then Trish would actually like to unmute and has something that she would like to share.
Okay.
Hey everybody. Trish Lawson, and I'm from Valparaiso, Indiana. I am the director of faith formation here for all ages. And I found this so far to be super helpful. So my daughter, I have a son and a daughter. They're both teens. My daughter is 13 and she has been struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder from an accident that stemmed back a few years. But because of that, other things have added on to her levels of anxiety, and she has acute anxiety to the point where you could see it building. Like what, she was hospitalized last year because she didn't know how to handle it, and she had a plan of execution, I guess, if you want to put it that way. And what is very helpful here in our church is our pastor is absolutely incredible being about self-help and being self-reliant, but when you can't, have your safe people in the church. And I find it so funny because one of our safe people for our daughter is our music guy, he's like the resident goofball, but she has that connection to him, and he, it could be awkward for him. And I've always told everybody who she finds safe, I'm like, if it's too much for you, just please tell me and I will find a way to navigate it elsewhere. They appreciate the fact that they feel that she feels safe with them. And so um, we have that in place. When she was hospitalized, right off the bat, the first thing I did the day after she was in there was I made myself an appointment, and I have seen a therapist ever since then, because the more tools you have in your tool belt, and it's not just for my child, it's other kids. I can recognize when an anxiety moment is happening with another child who maybe they don't know what's happening, but I could see almost similarities with my daughter, and it'll be like, hey, let's go do this, let's work on this. And it will just immediately just kind of like, okay, something else is going on. I'm not focused there anymore. And so, and then having that relationship with those parents, if you are comfortable in your congregation, like, a lot of parents will, I work with them on weekends, with their kids on Sundays, we've gotten a relationship. So if you've got that, you could say, he's, so and so seemed a little bit edgy today, or it seemed like he was like, kind of hyper, like is something going on. Well, Dad and I had this going on or whatever. I mean, sometimes they'll open up and sometimes they'll say, I don't know, but I'll just say, we did this instead and it seemed to work. And you find a way to almost like melt down that iceberg of, you know, I don't want to confide in you, to where it's like, thank you for helping them, because maybe they don't like you said, they don't know. And I mean, I'm no professional by any means, but I just going through therapy myself, it has been life-giving. not only to myself, but to our entire family. It has redirected the way I say things to my kids when I want to just like, what are you doing? It's like, I'll clean it up. It's a way to just like, this wasn't a big deal. So I think it's really helpful. But having a church and your pastor, I mean, people in that church that are safe people that you having that connection, I think that is such a strong piece. And I'm so grateful for the church that we have because our group is that we're so solid and it's a great community. So I think that's a really huge part of all of this too. Thank you.
Thank you. Um, did you have some more stuff, Jill? No. Okay. So as far as reviewing this, I know some of you have said, like you get something that seems good and then it's like really not great once you take a look at it. So thank you for vetting it before you put it out to your people. But sometimes reviews can give you a good idea. Give recommendations from other Christian educators in your area or pastors. Or partner with a mental health provider. I know that most of you probably have someone in your area who would love to speak about this stuff, would love to work with you, would love to make some more partnerships. In my area, like me and a couple other people are doing that. So find your Erica and, like, what do they recommend, or would they be able to look at this and see if it seems legit? So you don't always have to be the one doing all of the legwork there. Moving from kind of studies to more worship-based stuff. So on the one side you see We Pray Freedom so this is from the Freedom Church of the Poor. They do a lot of community organizing, but this is liturgies and rituals about freedom, social justice, suffering. You may find some good things. Again, this is just what I kind of had around. It's not the whole, like, the best resource ever. It's just, what I was throwing this presentation around. We have used a lot of A Sanctified Art, if you're familiar with them. They often do mainly kind of like seasonal, like Advent and Lent bundles that include visual art, poetry, activities. They usually have children, adults, a mix of things. And they often get at this touch point of fear, suffering, lament, grief, in a way that's really impactful. I have a friend who's a therapist who's kind of in a deconstruction process, left her church home, but she will come specifically when we're doing a sanctified art study because it just speaks to her and it feels life-giving. So there's that. It's not mental health, but it's at that intersection of like that deep human need. And get inspiration, like listen, go on YouTube, Google, what you're looking for and like what language are they using? What scriptures are they pulling from? Their stories may inspire your stories. I couldn't think of a great trauma or mental health sermon off the top of my head, but the one that I thought of was this one on racism, which of course, again, intersects with mental health. This is by Reverend Roger Niyashoka, who's at Village Church in Kansas City currently. And this, I just see people, he did a great job responding to that statement. So the question about like the just get over it, I only see people, I don't see color, is again that statement of like, well, what do we do with that? And he, again, used personal story about why that statement is harmful to him and his identity and being able to be seen as a whole person. So encourage you to, just get out there, immerse you. If it inspires and speaks to you, it probably will inspire and speak to your people as well. Again, thinking about if this is outside of some of your regular stuff, maybe it's a retreat, a visual, a prayer service, if there's things going on in your community that are specific to your community, that may be a time to do that. So longest night services, are kind of, or like Blue Christmas, like Christmas is often this joyous thing. A lot of our families are grieving or estranged. Like, do we have a separate space for them? Again, Sanctified Art often offers something if you want to purchase it. I found an example youth mental health retreat that's linked here. I will say that, again, things that aren't mental health specific but are intersectional can be so healing. Our community is very conservative, but we had a group of young people do our 3rd annual Pride event this summer, and 2 churches participated. Ours, kind of on the down low, because our church is a little hesitant still, and the Episcopal Church. And the Episcopal Church did a great follow through, hey, come to this event, the next day or whatever. It was a Pride Eucharist. So it was a specific liturgy. I think there are resources, of liturgies and stuff at some of the booths in the marketplace. And I know a lot of the people that went to that are people who had left the church for many years. But when they were specifically invited to an event that spoke to them, it was really helpful and very meaningful and a point of connection and community. So again, welcome is healing. Being seen for who you are is healing. Get training. Again, I forget the Zoom participant who spoke. The more tools we have, the more we're able to respond. So that could be training, that could be our own therapy, but this could be for staff, volunteers. In the APCE USA, deacons are a great option, instead of just being a committee, maybe training them to do some of this, compassion and justice work might be a good option. National organizations, I'll talk about some of the places you could get this. But local organizations, I don't know what's in your place. If you have a mental health coalition, if you have, a group that's really thriving. So again, finding a therapist who might be connected or talking to your health department about what's going on might be some good starting places to figure out what your local organizations are. Because there are great national organizations, but if your nearest training is, 6 hours away, maybe someone local might be better or more affordable. Your mid-council or denomination, like I said, I was able to host something for my synod. Soul Shop, some of you are familiar with. I just met them. They're at the marketplace. Their tagline is ministering to suicidal desperation. Those who are, thinking of it, people who have survived attempts, people who have survived the loss of someone to suicide. There's a lot of ripples of how suicide affects our community, and it seems like they have a very robust model. So check them out, might be a good option for you. Again, with this idea of starting where you're at, you probably have bulletin boards, resource tables, newsletters, social media. Use what you have. Build in, put an infographic out. What are your local resources? Are they posted? If you want to invite people to an event or ask people to volunteer for a training, use what you have. So here's an example of an infographic from NAMI. These are free, just the warning signs. And again, the woman who spoke on the Zoom, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, had mentioned that, kind of being able to notice those signs is a big part of that. Here are some things where stuff shows up around my church. We have letters, we have 988 hotline numbers. On our big resource table, we have some things about our groups. On my table, where I counsel people, I just have the little "You Matter," just that it's constantly in people's mind, right? It's very in the awareness. Just some general resources and guides that are linked here, mental health guides, things your congregation can do that have some of these tips in them. Just checking our time. So partnering with existing models is great because there's a lot of people that have done a lot of work in developing trainings and curriculums, so you don't have to do that from scratch. And National Mental Health can offer educational resources, workbooks, guides, full trainings. They can help you get involved with advocacy, some of them train you how to talk to your legislators or your city council, or even how to talk to maybe on a very small level, maybe you need some training on how to talk to your church about why this is important and why we need to do it. And thinking about, in national organizations, some of these have local chapters. So the National Alliance on Mental Illness is great, but they have NAMI Kansas, which does a lot of things, Kansas-specific stats, Kansas-specific outreach. But we also have a Southwest Kansas chapter that's kind of floundering to get its feet under it. But if they got up and running, that would be fabulous because they would host the local support groups and things. So kind of thinking, if there is a big group, what is my local connection? getting specific, what is the issue in your community? You know, some communities, gun violence is a big issue. Some communities, it's not. You know, some communities, you know, it's the youth don't have any positive places to go after school. You know, other places that's not as much of an issue. So thinking about in your context, and maybe just as small as your church, like, is this more of older adult mental health? You know, isolation, depression can be big, caregiver fatigue. So really thinking about what are the resources I need, because there is a resource for your specific situation. So on those national organizations, one I've mentioned already is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. I've done some partnering with them, so that's why they're kind of top of my mind. Over here, I have some resources on the Standing in the Gap model, which they've launched in Kansas to help faith communities stand in the gap between people who need help and the help that's not available sometimes in rural communities. They talked about 1 in 4 people will go to some kind of faith leader as their first person they talk to about a mental health concern. Primary care doctors and physicians are also a big one. But thinking about if for a quarter of people we might be that first line, how do we deal with that well? And have a plan. You know, like, what do we tell people? Do we know the resources? Where do we send them? And NAMI is great because they have like a basic education course that's free. I think you might have to be a NAMI member, but they have an open door membership that's $5, and then they have, you know, other membership models. But they have family to family, which is very much about, like, you know, your kids are struggling. How do you support your kids well? How do you advocate for them with the schools? What questions do you ask the doctors? Peer-to-peer is, you know, you've had your own struggles, you're supporting other people who've had their struggles. So those are all like educational models. I have some brochures that you can look at. They have NAMI Homefront for veterans. It's one of the larger mental health organizations in America, so they have a lot of things. The National Council for Mental Wellbeing hosts mental health first aid. And this is, I'm kind of checking our time. We have about 30 minutes. There's a video there that kind of highlights that. I don't think we'll look at it just for time, but it's kind of like, you know, we're trained in, you know, if you're on fire, stop, drop, and roll. You know, if someone's having a, you know, heart attack, you know, call 911. You know, if someone's passed out, you know, like, and you think it's you know, turn them on their side. But what do you do if someone's struggling with a mental health crisis? So this is a nationwide training. Some organizations get grants to offer this for free. So your local area, like our health department, offers this training for free to teachers, you know, our first responders. So look on their website, you can find if your local area has something. Mental Health America is great, and they also have regional areas that are smaller, but they have a lot of good educational stuff. Soul Shop, like I mentioned, offers, you know, things for leaders as well as, you know, some more specific context, adults, youth. More focused on kids, Active Minds is for kind of high school and college kids, so it's kind of designed to be almost like a student club model. But again, if we're thinking about getting outside of the church, if you have any connections with the schools, if you already work in the schools, Active Minds is great, and it's youth involved. You know, they're kind of running it, so we're not just talking at them. The Child Mind Institute has some great resources and videos and things. I have a link to them there. And in the marketplace, I connected with a couple of people, like I said, the free parenting app from Holy Disruptions, and it's kind of like you run into a disruption or a problem, how do you handle that well? Those are those great teaching moments. Like sometimes when we just put something out there, it doesn't land, but when it's right in our face, you know, that's a great time to talk about, you know, bullying or, you know, they had a meltdown, you know, like what was going on. And the Trauma and Resiliency Workbook that's in the marketplace, I have a copy of that. Yes.
If I could go back to, Julie is the one who shared about
Julie,
the
yes.
sand, so Trish was up
Oh,
here, but
about this
Julie
one.
was the one who recommended the sand tray therapy or sand tray storytelling. So I did a quick Google on it, and there's lots of kind of introductory resources available out there. Of course, vet for yourself before you would share that. But Julie also said she is very happy to share her experience with it with anybody that would like to dig a little. no pun intended, dig a little bit further in that. And if you're interested, she gave me permission to share her email, which is Julie, help me, I'm trying here, Julie Gavillo, JuliegVillo .aplaceofgrace@gmail.com.
So I don't know what was presented at APCE that she had the opportunity to do, but weirdly, I am offering a workshop tomorrow on Santre as a spiritual practice. Very small world stuff. So if you are interested, I'd also be happy to talk about my take on that. She may have a totally different resource there. Yeah, and they don't have it for online, but I'll get your email if someone can write that down for me so I can connect with her. That would be fabulous. So these are just some examples of some more specific, like I said, you can get it more specific depending on what's going on. You know, if you specifically are looking at suicide prevention or specifically like LGBTQ resources or sexual violence, there, you know, national organizations that specialize, you know, not just general mental health. And, you know, there's structured support groups like grief share and divorce care that are fairly broad-based, and it really depends on the particular facilitator, what their theological bent is. So those are things you could think about offering in your space. If you're recommending someone to go to another church for them, I would want to know who the facilitator was before that. Again, you know, people have different views on handling things. So yeah, just thinking about your specific concerns. I think sometimes it's like, is it better to lean towards a faith-based resource organization? We've kind of already covered, use faith-based resources cautiously, just to make sure you don't get in a situation where you get some of that spiritual bypassing, or you get like this emotional mountaintop moment where you feel really good and therefore I no longer need help, and then you kind of have a crash afterwards. A lot of really tragic outcomes have happened kind of because, you know, like I've been healed, I've been delivered, and I'm not going to take my meds, I'm not going to go to therapy, I'm not going to. And depending on what someone has going on with them, that may be where they're at in their recovery, and that's great. Or that could be something that is, you know, again, just a momentary thing. We pull out the supports and they drop into a really bad place. So if your church is kind of like, I don't want to, you know, do a training or a curriculum that's not about God, you can always add that in. Those are things you know about. You know about the Bible stories. But I would just point out, you know, for the PCUSA, under our kind of ecumenical section, it says we even can work with interfaith or secular organizations when the approaches show the promise of serving the mission of the church. So again, when I'm thinking about doing this training or this partnership, why am I doing it? How does that fit with our values? How does that fit with our mission and identity as a congregation? Or, you know, like, you know, if we're a Matthew 25 congregation, or if we, you know, like, whatever your values are, does what I'm trying to do fit with that? Then you have my blessing, you know. Good luck with whoever else you need to get on board. So, new partnerships in your space. A lot of our churches have a lot of unused space. So that is a resource we can use for whatever issue our community has. Like, I know a lot of communities are lacking childcare. You know, childcare facilities is an option. Housing is a huge issue. The marketplace has some resources on dealing with housing. But if you're thinking mental health with your space, I want you to kind of think about hosting groups. A lot of us may already have churches that host AA or NA, you know, but like maybe getting connected with NAMI, hosting that, and how do we tie in more and work with them? It's not just they're in our space, but like, do we know what they do? Do we refer people to them? You know, do they, you know, tell us about what needs they're having? A lot of times these groups are so freestanding that there's no real partnership, and depending on their structure and their leaders, sometimes that's how they want it. But if you're trying to do a ministry, you may want to choose an organization that is a little more collaborative. I mentioned the standing in the gap that I had done with NAMI. So we hosted like a a most of the day summit that gave training about what does mental health look like, how can churches respond well to that, brainstorming time for what are your church's next steps. And I think that was launched specifically in Kansas. So I don't know that your NAMI would have that, but like they can definitely also connect to NAMI Kansas. I think it'd be a great thing to spread. Hosting retreats would be huge. And again, is there someone you want to reach out to? Are your healthcare workers overburdened and burned out? Do you want to do a wellness retreat for your nursing staff? Would they come? You know, like, again, thinking about what does your community need? You might want to think about offering space towards a mental health coalition. So that little link there is to my horrible website for my mental health coalition organization. And this is what I was hearing in my community was, I don't know how to get in touch with a therapist, or we have our main area mental health center that a lot of people have had negative experiences with, so they want to go private practice, but they call someone, the line's disconnected, or they never get a call back, or they don't take my insurance, or they don't see kids, and you're already in crisis, you're already overwhelmed. So accessibility was a huge issue. Or there'd be events, like there'd be a suicide awareness event, but like nobody knew about it. I found out about it 3 days later. I was like, if I, as a mental health professional, don't know this is happening in my fairly small community, the general population does not know. So my vision was to create kind of a one-stop shop of like, can we make a list of providers that's regularly updated instead of this doctor has this paper list and this doctor has this, you know. It has been slow to get going because it's a passion volunteer kind of project, but you can see our website, it kind of talks about counseling more generally, and I want to eventually have like, are you looking for, you know, a faith-based provider? Are you looking for a Spanish-speaking provider, which is a huge need, underserved need in my area. So again, maybe your church has website that you already have and you're willing to host space for someone to put up a resource like that. Again, maybe you have a space for, like, they host our monthly meetings at the church where I serve, for the providers to get together, share referrals, do continuing ed, kind of prevent some provider burnout, helping the helpers kind of stuff. If you want to work with professionals, you might think about offering space to a business or a nonprofit. You'd have to have a use of space agreement that's specific to your congregation and your state and your city guidelines. But my counseling practice is a for-profit business. It's not very profitable, but it's a for-profit business, and I rent space from the church. So the way our tax things are is they can take rental income as long as it's, you know, within certain parameters, and they don't have to pay taxes on that as unrelated business income. I am not a lawyer or an accountant, and this does vary by your location, but if you have concerns about this, I think those legal implications are some of the biggest, like, places where churches get stuck as far as, like, use of space, partnering with a nonprofit. I have some resources here from Rooted Good. They have a Good Futures Accelerator. You see over on the resources about like how to rent well and what about the taxes. The investment and loan program booth has copies of these, and PCUSA congregations can get this whole Good Futures Accelerator package for, I think it's $375, and it walks like 8 people, like some kind of maybe your session or a vision planning board through what are our goals, what are our legacy, you know, do we have endowments, how could we use those well, do we build something, do we rent something? If you're interested in mental health, maybe that's where your church lands. So the rental agreement is great, you know, like finding a place, and the cost of a place is a huge problem for a lot of private practice therapists, you know, keeping them afloat, so that works really well for me. But some places donate their space to like a nonprofit counseling center and don't rent it out. Again, there's different implications to like your tax status. I don't know them. Get with someone who does. But like Prairie Sky Counseling Center in Kansas City works with several different faith-based organizations to share space with their counselors and their interns from the local university to offer free and sliding scale services. So it is doable. You know, like I just want to encourage you that if this is your passion, there is a way to make it work. So there's an example linked there for you guys. And other ideas other than just sharing space maybe that's volunteering or encouraging people to volunteer, leading some of these groups, you know, getting trained so you can train other people, joining a board. Like I said, the Southwest Kansas chapter of NAMI is having trouble getting going because they just don't have people for their steering committee to get things going, to promote, to like start some of these things. So you may have a mental health organization in your community that's just really looking for a couple of committed people to join them. Promoting an event, if something's already happening, do you mention it in worship? Do you say, hey, I'm going, would you like to come with me? Personal invitation is huge, not just announcements. Hosting things, bring in a guest speaker. Maybe that's, you know, someone you truly bring in that you know is awesome, or maybe that's just a local person you've made that connection with. Maybe they do a Minute for Mission, maybe they host a Sunday school class, maybe they come to your youth group, maybe they work with you to make a retreat or you host it. They could just do an information booth during fellowship hour, like, hey, did you know this is available? I have stickers and things. Fundraising, you know, that could be another thing depending on, you know, your resources and your people, what they have. Maybe you want to fundraise for an event, a group. Therapy scholarships can be huge. So some, you know, like if there is like Prairie Sky, who is a nonprofit, they can accept donations to pay for the cost of therapy. I want to find a way to do that, but as a for-profit, not ideal because, you know, like you don't get a tax break for that. But I mean, hypothetically, people could give me money for that if they wanted, I guess. Therapist scholarship. If you are in a place where you're like, there are no child therapists in my area, are there people who want to be child therapists but can't afford the training? Would your church be willing to do that? And again, like, what would you ask of them? Like, you know, would they be willing to lead, you know, one workshop a year for 3 years? Or, you know, I don't know what you would want as kind of a partnership, because usually if you're investing in something, but if you really feel like this is a need in your community, is that something that you would be willing to invest in? Okay. So, I want to leave the rest of our time for kind of sharing questions and ideas and thinking about some of these next steps. Because I want you to leave here, because I know when I go to a big conference, it's really exciting in the moment, and then I stick all this stuff in a pile and I never look at it again, right? So I want you to think to yourself, like, out of everything you heard, and as we continue to talk, like, what inspired you? Like, oh, that's an idea, or that's something I want to look into. What do you need to research? Is that I need to find a local therapist, or I want to see if we have a NAMI group, or I want to go talk to Soul Shop? And then think about who would be your partners or next steps. Is that I need to text my pastor, I need to email the head of my committee, I need to reach out to my friend who has connections with the health department. You might want to make a draft of that right now on your phone so you don't forget about it. Or block this off on your calendar. Like, you know what, next 2 Saturdays from now, I'm gonna pull out all my stuff from APCE and I'm gonna actually look at this. Because if you don't make a specific time to do it, it's always next week, it's always next year. So those SMART goals, like let's make space for this. You know, like you came here because this was important to you. So the workshop made a structured space. From here on, you're going to have to make a structured container for making sure you're moving towards your goals with this. So I kind of went through that fast because I wanted an opportunity to, you guys are all going to be interested in different parts of that. So what thoughts, questions, resources to share do you guys have? Yes, Nathan. Jill will bring you the microphone so our Zoom friends can hear you.
I am interested in the grief group, and I've looked into grief share, but one of the things that I would like to see more is any grief being a part of the sharing. I feel like most of the grief share that I am seeing is about a death, and grief can come in lots of ways. So I wondered if anybody had any other grief knowledge on curriculum or books or something that is outside of just death grief, but it could be like relationship loss or financial or, you know, strain of family, whatever that is, and what that would look like more so in a wider sense.
Yeah. Any thoughts from anyone else before I have a thought about that? Anybody do grief support at your church of any kind? No, okay.
We have Stephen's ministry.
Okay.
Which is it's a broader spectrum than that, but most folks, I think, that are care receivers seem to be in a grief process. Highly recommend Stephen's ministry. If you don't know what that is, I can talk just a little bit about it. Having been not a Stephen's minister, but a care receiver at one point in my life, it's a
Yeah.
phenomenal ministry.
I thought about putting Stephen's ministry on here, but I am not familiar. I've never been in a church that had it. So yeah, if Jill, if you could share a little bit about that.
Now?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
just briefly. Like, yeah, what are Stephen's, like, so they're trained lay
Yeah,
people.
they're highly trained. There's Stephen leaders and there's Stephen ministers, and the leaders have actually even more training than the ministers. But Stephen ministers have to go through, you know, a whole process of training and many hours of that. And then they're given, and it's all confidential as far as the care receiver, like which minister has care receivers and who those people are. No one knows except for the leaders that have assigned that and the ministers, unless the care receiver shares that, but otherwise it's confidential. And it's like my experience with it, it was after I had lost my mother, and so, you know, the pastors do all the things that the pastors do, and then the pastors have to kind of move on to other congregation members to like their other duties, but you're still sitting here in your grief for however long that is. And so it was, my experience with my minister was probably about 2 years, and she listened to probably the same stories over and over and over again, I can imagine, but with the same grace and newness and love and kindness and care that I could have ever imagined. And so it's as long as the care receiver feels they need. And, you know, you kind of develop your schedule with them according to yours. It was just a really wonderful, wonderful experience. And they're, like I said, they're very highly trained to walk through life with you. Yeah. So highly recommend, if your church doesn't have it, maybe look into it. It's helpful for your pastors as well to have that team with to work along with.
Yeah. And that was my feeling, is that there's a lot of training that goes into it, which is fabulous, right? But it's kind of a high startup place, which again, depending on where you're at, you know, your church may not be ready for that. But that's an example of, you know, if you had someone who was really dedicated, had some time, wants to go out, meet people where they're at, they really, you know, focus, how do you listen well? How do you respond without, you know, platitudes or trying to hold people's emotions in? And thank you for sharing that was a helpful resource. Grief outside of the context of death is something that I think a lot of people feel like, oh, well, it's not really grief, or it's not significant enough, but we can be grieving the loss of a job, right? I think about some people, you know, the mass layoffs we've had over the past year. Like, a lot of people, you know, have worked in this their entire career. It was their dream job. They just got out of college and, you know, they thought they were, you know, on a path. Huge amount of grief that can come with that. A lot of grief comes with getting some type of disability, the loss of something you once had or relied on. Moving, you know, refugees have a lot of loss. They've often left behind loved ones, their culture, everything they've ever known. So I think that's a really important topic. I'm not a grief share trainer, but my pastor is, and she's offered some loosely structured around grief share. Like, if you're following their tried and true model, I guess they're pretty like, this is what you do. But if you are familiar enough with it and have your own knowledge, I might encourage you to kind of tweak it to your setting. Maybe that's how you advertise it. People experiencing loss of all kinds, and list some of those losses. Because often if they see something like grief share, they're gonna think, oh, well, if I haven't lost someone or I haven't lost someone in the past year, this isn't for me. And again, loss for people can take different courses, right? Like, someone may need loss support, maybe it's 3 years out and they're like, oh, well, this isn't fresh, saying any loss is welcome. And you setting that standard and that vibe. As far as books and curriculum, I saw I think it's the Asberg Fortress Book Place had a book called The Memory Box, which is a book that was recommended to me at a play therapy training. And then I saw it there and I was like, oh, I didn't realize that this was, from you guys. And he was saying, well, I just went to a conference for funeral home directors and they already had this resource, and I brought it to market it to them. And it kind of talks about like rituals for remembering, right? So like pictures and, kind of building your thing, which could be true for a place we're missing, a lifestyle we were missing. And even though it's a kid's book, like honestly, kids' book can be great for adults. I've found often it takes like this really big concept that, requires homework and pre-reading into something fairly relatable through a story or a parable. So that might be something to think about. It looks like they have a new like holiday one, again, thinking about holidays being a particular time to minister to people who are grieving. Rates of mental health crises definitely increase over the holidays, whether that's because we're, missing people or being around people that cause things. So those are just some initial thoughts of kind of build your own way, maybe use some kids' stuff and do some of those activities together, some of those tangible, kinds of things. But I will keep in mind, and if you email me for the slides, also put in there grief resources, and if I happen to run across something, I'll shoot it your way, Nathan. Okay.
Erica. Yes. Julie in the comments about some resources. She says, I lead Artful Expressions of Grief, which involves art and spiritual practices of various kinds and meets 6 times, ending with a piece of completed art. I also give 2 books in addition to the Stevens Ministry set of books. So kind of backtracking on that, after you go through your process of grief, you do with your caregiver in Stevens Ministry, you're given a series of books that's very timely. They time them out and give them in a series over, I think, a year's time. Small books, but they're great resources. But she also gives tear soup and water bugs and dragonflies. So she recommends those resources.
Yeah, I've heard of tear soup. Okay. I wanted to highlight some of the stuff I have out on the tables. Sorry for the people on Zoom. But one of the things you see, they look like little daily calendar pages with little animals on them. So that's by an artist called The Latest Kate. That's what her page is on Facebook. I can't remember her full name. But I often sometimes give these to clients. They are, I don't know how you'd say, like kind of like little support animals, like it gets better, like you deserve rest. And yes, these things are true, but sometimes having like a little visual with it or something you could stick on your mirror can be really helpful. So those are things that like, when I follow her on Facebook, I'll like save the little picture and like shoot them out to some people. So again, like this isn't, a mental health curriculum or anything, but it's just like little acts of kindness kind of things is something to think about. I have a lot of resources on the 988 hotline. Could you raise your hand for me if you're already familiar with like 988 and what it does? Okay, so there's a couple of people that aren't. So 988 is a nationwide, in the United States, are we all United States? I know sometimes we have some Canadians. It's kind of like if you had a physical emergency, you would call 911, For this is a crisis of a mental health nature, you would call 988. And they wanted it kind of standardized because there were so many hotlines and warm lines and things like that. And there still are some out there, and there are more specific ones if you're looking for like a specific kind of group, you know, like for people of color, trans people, there are still some hotlines, and funding for those, you know, is sometimes shaky. But this is kind of across the board. That way it's short, people can remember it. You know, you're with someone, you don't really know what to do, you don't know what the next steps are. You can call 988. The volunteers who answer those calls, sometimes they're staff members, in most areas they're volunteers, have quite a bit of training. So they're usually, you know, very calm, very reassuring, you know, they'll talk with people. Sometimes they'll just talk to you. Like if you just need someone to talk to, you're just at your breaking point, they'll talk to you. But their goal is to eventually connect you to a resource in your local area, and they have some kind of database, you know, based on, you know, your cell phone location. Like, you know, it looks like you're close to Oklahoma City or, you know, whatever. You know, are you familiar with this counseling center or this, you know, hospital room or wherever they might direct people. The hard thing, if you live in a rural area, there may not be a lot of resources to direct people to. That's something I have found a little bit of a problem. But for the most part, I think it's a really good resource. I have not had a lot of any like kind of bad feedback about it. When they first rolled it out, a lot of people were saying they were on hold for a long time. That doesn't seem to be a problem anymore. So this is a great resource, which again, we have coasters, we have business cards. Our kind of health coalition in our area got a bunch of these resources for free and just gives them out all the time. So again, in your local community, you know, like if you're wanting posters, coasters, business cards, there may be someone who can get those to you for free. So that's why those partnerships are important. Also on the table, I have a lot of these little green ribbons, which are mental health awareness ribbons. And I have buttons and bookmarks and things like that. So those I ordered for like tabling events from Oriental Trading Company. So you can get a big, you know, mental health awareness, stop the stigma bulk thing for an event, a youth event or whatever, fairly affordable. They have different things like not every disability is visible, you know, talk about it, things like that. Let's see. And then there are two sets of little cards that are, I think, the signs of PTSD and suicide warning signs. Again, I think I got those from Oriental Trading Company, and they came in like a pack of cards. And again, just awareness, good handouts, maybe to give to your church staff or volunteers, have out at that resource table, to build it into the culture. This is something that's known, talked about. I also just have a couple little fidgets because, you know, knowing that everyone's different, has different support needs is part of building that foundation of being able to talk about these things. There are some Spanish resources. I don't know if any of you, that is something that is relevant to you. If it's not, feel free to not take those. But please take those with you, less things I have to fly back to Kansas with me. But, you know, so for very, very little investment, you could have like little conversation starter things. Or, oh, I guess there's some pins that have semicolons on them. So the semicolon has become kind of like a symbol for suicide prevention, with the idea that like a sentence could have ended, but the author continued the sentence, you know, like a life could have ended, but the person, you know, made the choice to continue living. So those can be kind of subtle signs. Sometimes, you know, if you have something on your backpack or the wall in your office and people see it and they recognize it, they may realize like, oh, this may be someone that I can talk to about these feelings I've been having, even if you've never had a direct conversation with those people. You know, much like having, you know, like a pride flag could tell someone, you know, this is a safe place. There are signs that can help with mental health issues as well. Yes. Nathan's going to share another resource with us.
There's an organization called Hope for the Day that's based out of Chicago, but it's a national suicide prevention. They do work in lots of things, but one of the helpful resources I'm going to share is on their website, Hope for the Day. If you click on a button, it says Find Help. You can put in any zip code, and it's a curated list of all the providers that are in that zip code. And it can be mental health related, it could be people who help with food and housing, pro bono work for lawyers, all types of stuff. And it's a curated list that they can constantly update. So if you do happen to find a broken link in there, they'll happily, you can reach out. But most of the time, all of that stuff is still active, and they go through that list constantly. So any zip code, you can plug that in, and then it pulls up all those resources in your area.
Yeah, so I will check what they have for my area. And when we're looking for directories, another place that some people have success is your United Way often has directories for resources in your area, again, broken down by mental health, or if the mental health crisis is related to, I need a safe place to stay tonight, or I need, whatever, sometimes you need a different kind of resource. So thank you guys so much. I know we do have a little bit of time before the next workshop comes in, so if you want to chat with me, look at any of these resources that are mine, take those resources. But this is me. Here is an email address. Again, this is my counseling email address. The Christian Ed at APCE USA one is my church. Either one will get to me. If you wanted to do a follow-up, 15-minute call about ideas for your specific area, I'd be happy to do that by Zoom. If you wanted something more tailored to your area, I'd be happy to do that. Again, find a local provider, that'd be great, but if you want it to be me, I would be happy to meet with your church leadership on something more specific to your context. We can schedule something. So thank you guys so very much. Any final questions as we're wrapping up? Okay, thank you guys.